Hi. In today's film, we're going to take a look at two main things. The first is we're going to look at Darwin's response to the argument from design, to the teleological argument. Then what we'll do after that is we'll take a look at the problem of evil, one of the most common arguments against God's existence. So let's review a little bit from the last video and what the argument was, the argument from design was. So the teleological argument is based on two premises and a conclusion. The first being that anything that has a design had a designer. The world that we live in has a design. Therefore, the argument concludes the world we live in must have had a designer. This is God. And in the last video, we looked at some of the common types of things that people refer to when giving evidence of design. Things like the eye, or the way the human hand works, or the complexity of human DNA. All things that would be really hard to imagine simply coming together through random processes. So what we'll look at is Darwin's response to that argument, because he attacks it, and pretty specifically he's going to attack that argument by trying to attack the second premise. He's attacking the claim that the world has a design. In particular, he's going to use his theory to try to explain away the appearance of design. All right. So Darwin, in looking at the world, is living at a time where a few things have gone on. The first is he's living at a time in which they're doing basic paleontology, right? They're digging up bones. They're finding fossils of creatures that have never existed on the planet. And extinction poses a pretty severe threat to the argument from design, because if organisms go extinct, I mean, what does that actually say about the designer? That the designer didn't put things together very well? It's questionable. Another thing that he saw that was really challenging for him was a particular wasp. Now, this wasp would sting and lay eggs inside a caterpillar. The larva of the wasp would then slowly digest the caterpillar from the inside, and then keeping it alive, not eating the vital organs, just eating other stuff. And then at the end, the wasps would pop out of the caterpillar, killing it. And he looked at that whole system and he thought that was just absolutely inconsistent with the idea of this all-powerful, benevolent being. It just didn't seem to fit his understanding of what that kind of being might design. Also in his travels, famously, he comes upon a set of islands, the Galapagos Islands, right, that are remote enough that the organisms that are there are different than organisms elsewhere. They seem to have gone through a process that's different than creationism. Again, if we go with the theory of design and this idea that God created organisms, it seems like God would have just thrown all these organisms across the planet kind of, right, universally. But what Darwin was finding is that in areas of isolation like the Galapagos, a couple things. He found animals that you didn't find anywhere else, and you didn't find some of the animals you found a lot of other places. And famously with the work with the finches and a few other things that maybe you're aware of from, your readings back in middle school and high school, he developed the following theory, right? His theory of natural selection. So let's see if we can put some of the pieces together. The first main piece, at least for me, for the theory of evolution is this idea of genetic mutation, right? So genetic mutations are typically birth defects. They're random, and in most cases, these genetic variations, these birth defects, they kill the organism. The organism doesn't survive. It's like nature made an experiment, the experiment failed. Sometimes these mutations are gigantic, other times they're really, really subtle. So if we were to compare all the people in this class, we'd notice quite a bit of genetic variation. Some of you are shorter, others are taller, my skin's really fair, some of you might have lots more pigment in your skin. I'm losing the hair on my head, some of you aren't. I have blue eyes, some of you might have other colored eyes. So we have all this diversity, these genetic mutations. The other part about these genetic mutations seems to be that when two organisms within a species that have the same mutation, when they mate, their offspring has that mutation. So if I were to marry a woman who had blue eyes and have children with her, in all likelihood our children would have blue eyes, right? So these traits seem to carry down, right? The other important part of Darwinism is that I think that we can safely say that we live in an environment that is not stable, right? That is, the environment shifts. We go through times like a few years ago where we had a really, really bad drought, and then over this past year we've had a ridiculous amount of rain, indeed too much. Please make it stop, right? Um, we've had various ice ages that have totally affected the planet. We've had times of great warmth, great cold. The cycles of currents within the seas seem to change. So it's not a stable environment. I remember when I was a kid looking at a map of the world, thinking, "Wow, doesn't it look just like Africa?" Right? Could South America could fit up in that like they were puzzle pieces. And lo and behold, later on we learn, okay, yeah, they're puzzle pieces, tectonic plates. Even the continents are totally shifting. They're moving around. So the overall weather patterns in any one place are going to change greatly over the millennia, over the 1,000-year time periods. So we have mutations, and then we have these changes in the environment. And when those two things come together, we get this idea of fitness. That is, if an organism has a set of traits that give it an advantage over other organisms within its species, or better yet, when that species has advantages over other similar species, well, those attributes, those mutations, those tricks that help the organism, in a weird way, it fills a gap. It's able to survive in that environment while things that don't have that trait die off. And then again, when the parents, the ones that survive, have offspring, the offspring has those traits. So let's try a rather silly example, but I think it illustrates it. So we can say thousands of years ago, there might have been a whole bunch of these small deer-like creatures, and over the years, maybe we developed a range in neck size because of genetic variation. Some had slightly longer necks than others. Well, there's not a huge difference, but there's a slight variation. In the same way, we might say there's variation in heights of people. And then maybe there's a really, really bad drought. And with that really bad drought, the giraffe with, sorry, I already gave it away. The deer-like creatures with the slightly longer necks have an advantage, right? They can reach leaves and bushes and stuff that the ones with just slightly necks can't reach. And so the ones with the slightly longer necks survive. They breed, their offspring have the longer necks. Well, again, they are stable then for a while, they breed, and yet again we have genetic variation over a certain period of time. That is, some will again have slightly longer necks than others. So before the genetic variation, it may have been like this. Now it's like this. The aggregate's a little bit higher. Again, there's a drought, and lo and behold, again, only the ones with the longest necks survive. And if we multiply this out, we can see how over thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years, these small deer-like creatures slowly changed or evolved into giraffe, right? Now, a design theorist might look at a giraffe and say, hey, that creature was designed with a really long neck to let it reach high into the trees. But on Darwin's theory, nothing like that happened, right? It's not like the giraffe was designed, it adapted, right? Another example is I live in the redwood forest, and every now and then, it's happened 3 different times over the 15 or so years that I've lived here. I've seen 3 all white squirrels. They were juveniles, they weren't very old, and it were a couple years apart that I saw them. But at 3 different times I saw them. They didn't last very long, right? Because with their bright white color, they weren't very camouflaged in this type of an environment. And so they got caught and they got killed. Okay, so let's say though that there's a giant volcanic explosion, a whole bunch of stuff goes up into the air that causes global cooling, and lo and behold, there's a new ice age. Scientists tell us that once these forests were covered in snow. It's hard to believe, but once they were covered in snow, right? And so let's say with the new ice age, that happens yet again. It's covered in snow. We live in an almost all-white environment. Well, now those squirrels that are all white have an advantage. They have a mutation that actually helps them fit into the environment. Now it's all the brown squirrels that are getting caught and eaten, and only the white ones survive. Now when the 2 white squirrels that survived get together and have offspring, lo and behold, more often than not, their offspring are white. And this is what's kind of exciting. In a really short amount of time, we'd go from having a forest filled with brown squirrels to having a forest filled with white ones, right? Indeed, some of you may recall this example from Britain during the Industrial Revolution, where the moths changed from brown to black as the bark on the trees turned from brown to black because of the soot that was covering it. Okay. So evolution tries to explain that, and no, it's this other process, right, that produces organisms. Next question then, what would we look at as evidence? How would we decide? Okay, well, there's lots of evidence in favor of Darwinism. A lot of the evidence is the fossil record, and the fossil record's kind of interesting, right? The fossil record shows a couple things. The fossil record shows, well, first of all, that currently there are a lot of animals that are alive that we don't find bones for really deep in those other sediments of Earth in the planet. And we also have a lot of bones from those really old layers of dirt that are of animals that no longer exist. So we have a huge issue with extinction. A whole lot of animals have gone extinct. And when we look at that fossil record of the soil layers in between, we find in many cases skeletons of other animals. And when scientists put all these skeletons together, lo and behold, seems to find that we have slow change over time, right? Another example of evidence in favor of Darwinism are hip bones in whales. Yep, whales have hip bones. That's puzzling because whales don't have legs, so why would they need hips? Why would a designer put hips in an organism that he or she did not intend to walk? Well, we think that they're leftovers. They're vestigials, right? They sort of remained, right? And so scientists, upon discovering these bones that they are hip bones, are like, well, if whales had hip bones, if we look in the fossil record, we ought to be able to find whales with varying types of legs. If whales at some point in evolution lost legs, then for a while they must have had little measly legs that didn't do much work, kind of like pollywog legs. And before that, maybe they were a little stronger legs that allowed them to crawl up onto shore. And if we went way back in the geologic record, we should be able to find skeletons of whale-like creatures that went back and forth between land and water. We should be able to find all those things, right? Well, lo and behold, what happens when you look at the fossil record? We find those things. They're out there, right? So there's quite a bit of evidence in favor of evolution. Yeah. So engaging stuff, and it ends up being, I think, fairly engaging challenge to Darwin's or to the teleological argument, right? Because if we have this other story, it explains quite a bit. It explains, for example, why I have bad backaches and why my knees hurt sometimes in a way that design doesn't, right? It explains it because if you say, okay, well, human beings weren't actually made to be standing straight up, that we actually came from a position where we were hunched over, well, our backs, evolutionarily, aren't actually used to supporting all that weight for all the many years we're on the planet. So vast majority of human beings as they age get, lo and behold, lower back pains. And huge number of athletes have problems with their knees because, as a couple of doctor friends have once told me, knees actually seem to be designed to be bent, not straight out. Once they go straight out, all that protective stuff that's supposed to be in there gets exposed, and that puts a lot of strains on the tendons and ligaments, the things that a lot of people get hurt when they're playing soccer as a kid. Again, they weren't designed, right, to do those sorts of things because, as Darwin would argue, they weren't designed at all. Okay, now let's talk about the problem of evil. One of our main arguments against God's existence. Before we get there, though, let's try a little thought experiment, or maybe better yet, we'll call it analogy. If I'm wondering about the existence, let's say, of the Loch Ness Monster, it seems that it's going to be really hard to prove that something doesn't exist. Do you see how that's a double negative? You can't prove that something doesn't exist. There's something weird about that, right? So if you said, well, what's your proof that the Loch Ness Monster does not exist? Well, I think one of the things I would cite as proof that it does not exist is the lack of evidence that it does, right? So if you can't show me like actual photographs of this creature, or there's not enough fish in the loch to support it, or no one's found any of the waste material from it, no one's found a dead one, right? At some point, the lack of proof for actually counts as proof against, right? And so you could take a look at where we are in this chapter on philosophy of religion, and we've gone through now the three main arguments for God's existence: teleological, ontological, cosmological, and the evidence, first of all, is really scarce, right? It's like there's not much evidence for God's existence. And the bigger problem is that it doesn't look like we have much evidence for one of the religions over another. So, for example, even if we buy one of these arguments, even if we say Darwin was wrong and there was a designer, again, it doesn't seem to help us with the really important question, which is which of the various religions is true. So what do you do with that? I don't know what you do with it, except please do this. I think people are welcome to have the religious views that they want to have. This is part of our cultural heritage. But since the evidence is so scarce and everybody's sort of taking a shot in the dark, maybe we ought to be really accepting of alternative points of view, right? So rather than going out and telling everybody we know they're right, we can say, well, I've taken my best guess, you take your best guess, and hey, let's all hang out and have a barbecue, right? Okay, problem of evil. The problem of evil is the only argument we're going to look at against God's existence, and it's probably the number one reason why people of faith end up losing their faith. So the problem of evil is presented as an inconsistent triad. We have three claims that can't all be true at the same time, right? The first claim is that God is all-powerful, which means God can do anything she wants. The second premise is that God is perfectly good, which seems to mean that she wants goodness. And the third claim is that evil exists, right? And if this was a regular class, I'd ask students to start there. And let's try the little thought experiment. Okay, here's our thought experiment. So I'm sitting on my deck, and an alien lands on my deck and hops out of his spaceship and says, hello, I'm an alien. I'm studying this stuff called evil. I'm told there's a lot of it on Earth. Can you take and show me some examples of it? Where could we take this alien? Well, I could take him to various parts of the county near me where people are starving, where they're homeless. I think I could probably turn the television on for them and show them the various things that are going on in the world. I could take them to a library and show them human history, a history of slavery, of genocide, of people being denied certain rights. I could take them to various places on the planet where wars are being fought, often by two different groups of people, both claiming to have the right God. The irony is thick. My favorite place to take that alien would be to take him to the Children's Oncology Unit at Stanford. This is a place where little kids are dying of cancer. And while some of you in the comfort of your living rooms might want to say, well, how is that evil? If you've been a person to see someone who's died of cancer, it's evil. I mean, that's evil. And the pain and suffering that the parents have to go through watching their kids suffer, it seems unimaginable, right? So it's, evil, it seems like there's a lot of evil on our planet. And indeed, I think in many cases, we think that the evil actually outweighs the good, right? Evil, though, seems to me of two sorts. Some of the evil that's caused in the world is a direct result of human action. So people sometimes are really bad to other people, and they cause pain and suffering. Sometimes people cause pain and suffering even though they don't mean to. So they were trying to do something nice, but they ended up causing pain and suffering. That seems to be one kind of evil. But there's this deeper, more difficult kind of evil that we have to be able to somehow rectify, and that is the evil of the very system that we live in. I mean, right now I'm sitting on a very beautiful deck in the middle of the Santa Cruz redwoods, but, it's a world that is red in tooth and claw. You know, it's a world with tectonic plates that cause tsunamis. It's a world where people get cancer and Alzheimer's disease, and there's flesh-eating bacteria and ticks and West Nile virus and, you know, sudden infant death syndrome and, you know, appendectomy. I mean, wow, wow, you know. And those things have nothing to do with human action at all. Those just have to do with how the world's made. Okay, so back to our problem of evil here. It's set up in a way where if any two of the claims are true, the third has to be false. So shall we give it a try? All right, so if God's all-powerful, God can do anything she wants, yet evil exists, there's only one explanation. God doesn't give a shit, right? God doesn't care about the evil that's like plaguing human beings. Well, if that were true, then our second claim must be false. God can't be perfectly good. The second option is to consider that 2 and 3 are true. So if God is good, God really, really wants goodness, but evil persists. The only explanation is that God's like powerless to stop it, right? God can't possibly be all-powerful. And finally, if 1 and 2 are true, 3 has to be false, right? So if God's all-powerful and perfectly good, why the evil, right? Okay, so this is a real problem. It's a big enough problem that this is one of the number one thing that people who go off to seminary or go on to theology school end up studying, because if you're going to be, be in the clergy, a lot of the work that you're going to be doing is with people who are trying to deal with the problem of evil in their own life, right? They'll have a loved one who's died, or maybe somebody has a kid who's passed away. And what you're looking for is some sort of a response to the problem of evil. A response to the problem of evil has a really cool name. They call it a theodicy. And there's a bunch of theodicies out there. So we're going to go through a couple, just so that you can see that the vast majority of common theodicies are really not so good, right? So one theodicy is that evil is God's punishment for wrongdoing. Horrific theodicy, right? Seems terrible, but bear with me, because this was actually a really common response. Think of Florence in the Middle Ages. That's the place where the Renaissance kind of began. The Medici family, all these folks, right? At some point during the Renaissance, a major plague ravages Europe, killing 1/3 of the people in Florence. And there's this priest, Savonarola, who comes along and he says, look, the plague is God's punishment for all your sin. What sin? The sin of vanity. You guys were so cocky and showing off all your fineries and so materialistic that you angered God, so God sent a plague, right? The reality is much more sinister. The reality is that about 100 years before, there was a pope who was convinced that cats were the helpmates of witches, right? They did the work of witches. So people, not wanting to be seen as witches, got rid of their cats. Well, as soon as you get rid of all the cats, all of a sudden the rat population goes up. And when the rat population goes up, there's more fleas on rats. And lo and behold, guess what it was that passed the plague? The fleas on the rats. Again, really ironic, right? Okay, so it's really hard, though, to take that seriously as a theodicy, that God uses evil as a way to punish us, mainly because of things like the Stanford's Children Oncology Unit. Could those kids possibly have done anything so terrible to justify that kind of harm? Also, if maybe their parents did really horrible things, well, the parents should be punished. You can't punish the kids, right? So we have a distribution problem. It seems that the people who suffer evil aren't necessarily the ones who produce it, right? And also some of the people who I would consider really, really evil on our planet seem to have really nice overall lifestyles sometimes. So while I would like it to be true, good things don't happen to good people, bad things don't happen to bad people, right? It's just now distributed. So, and to finish up with this one, if you lost a father to something like cancer, and a priest told you that your dad suffered because he was a really bad person, that's why God allowed the evil to happen to him, that'd just be bullshit, right? You're just going to be like, no, that ain't going to work. Okay, so what other theodicies are there? Well, one of the common theodicies is evil is God's plan, right? It's or the God works in mysterious ways. That one ain't going to work either, right? Because if God has a plan, the question is, does God have to use evil in his plan? Well, no, he's all powerful. Okay, well, if God doesn't have to use evil in his plan, does God want to? Well, no, God's perfectly good. Okay, so if God uses evil in his plan, it either has to be that God was powerless to prevent it, or, again, didn't give a care and allowed it, in which case God's not perfectly good. Okay.